Hello and welcome to the IB Economist YouTube channel. In this tutorial, we are going to study about externalities. The contents of the tutorial will be as following. First, we will begin by looking at the definition of externalities and some simple examples of externalities. Then we'll look at the different types of externalities. We'll then have a look at the marginal and social cost and the marginal and social benefit and see how these are connected to the idea of externalities. Then we are going to define the difference between the social and the private. Then we are going to look at the four types of externality: the positive externality of production, the positive externality of consumption, the negative externality of production, and the negative externality of consumption. Finally, we're going to look at practical solutions to each of the four types of externalities. Okay, let's start with the definition. Externalities occur whenever a third party, which is neither the consumer nor the producer of a good, is affected either positively or negatively by a market transaction. By a market transaction, we mean the sale and the consumption of a product. Externalities are a form of market failure. Because of their existence, the market often is unable to reach the true equilibrium levels. Okay, let's have a look at some simple examples of externalities. Now, in this first example, imagine that we have two people, Mr. Green and Mr. Yellow. Consider that Mr. Green sells an economics textbook to Mr. Yellow, who in return pays a lump sum of money to Mr. Green. Now, in this situation, both Mr. Green and Mr. Yellow are happy because Mr. Yellow receives what he wanted for his money. He pays exactly the amount which he wanted to pay for that economic textbook, and Mr. Green is happy because he saw the textbook for the right price, which he was willing to accept. These are our first and second party. Imagine that we now add a third party to this transaction, Mr. Red. Imagine that Mr. Red and Mr. Yellow are friends and that Mr. Yellow gives the economics textbook to Mr. Red so that he can read it and learn some economics from it. In this case, we would have a positive externality because Mr. Red had not paid for the economics textbook, but because Mr. Yellow purchased the economics textbook, Mr. Red is able to read it for free. Now let's have a look at another example. Once again, we have Mr. Green and Mr. Yellow. This time, Mr. Green sells a pack of cigarettes to Mr. Yellow. Once again, both of them are quite happy with the market price, so Mr. Yellow gets his cigarette and Mr. Green gets his money. The problem now occurs because when Mr. Yellow smokes, Mr. Red, who is a non-smoker, will be affected because he becomes a passive smoker. In this situation, we would have a negative externality. So you can see how in the first example, the market transaction between Mr. Green and Mr. Yellow affected positively Mr. Red. In the second transaction, the purchase of cigarettes by Mr. Yellow from Mr. Green has affected negatively Mr. Red. Whenever we have positive externalities, it essentially means that we either consume or produce too little. Think to our previous example with Mr. Green, Mr. Yellow and Mr. Red. Mr. Green should have produced two economics textbooks and he should have sold them to both Mr. Yellow and Mr. Red. But Mr. Green only produced one textbook, so he sold that to Mr. Yellow, and Mr. Yellow and Mr. Red had to share that textbook. That would mean that whenever we have a positive externality, we are either under-consuming or under-producing. Positive externalities occur whenever a merit good is being offered on the market. A merit good is called so because the good is beneficial and should be consumed at a greater rate. As a result, whenever we have positive externalities, if we increase the consumption or the production of the good, we would gain additional welfare to our daily lives. In instances of negative externalities, we either consume too much or produce too much. As a result, whenever we have negative externalities, we suffer from overconsumption or overproduction of a product. Negative externalities occur whenever a demerit good is being offered on the market. A demerit good is a good which is harmful to the consumer or to the society. As a result, with negative externalities, we are going to have a deadweight loss of welfare unless we actually cut back our consumption or production of the good. We can summarize the following two types of externalities. First of all, we can have positive and negative externalities. For now, you can think of them as useful and harmful, though I must warn you, this is a simplification of positive and negative. It actually has more significant meaning, and positive externalities do not actually mean that they're useful. It means that we can benefit from correcting them. Then externalities can be divided into two more categories, of production and of consumption, which is related to our own behavior. Let's have a look at this matrix. So we can either have positive or negative externalities shown at the horizontal header at the top, or externalities of production or of consumption shown in the first column. When we combine this, we get the four types: positive externalities of production, which creates a problem of underproduction; positive externalities of consumption, which creates the problem of underconsumption; negative externality of production, which has been created by overproduction; and negative externality of consumption, which happens when we overconsume a product. We are now going to have a look at the idea of a marginal social cost and a marginal social benefit. First, we'll start by considering a simple supply and demand diagram. By definition, the demand represents the quantity demanded given the price level, and supply represents the quantity supplied given the same price level. And when these two are equal, we achieve an equilibrium, at which point the socially optimal price determines the optimal quantity supplied and demanded. Let's have a look at this graphically. This diagram shows precisely this relationship between supply and demand. We can see that we have a market. On the vertical axis we have the price, on the horizontal we have the quantity per time period, and we have a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve. When supply and demand equal, we get the equilibrium E with the corresponding price PE and quantity QE. Note that when the price is P, the quantity demanded equals to QE, and when the price is P, the quantity supplied equals once again to QE. So QE is our optimal point when supply equals demand. We can look at this interaction between supply and demand from a slightly different perspective. First, imagine that the true demand curve can be seen as a marginal social benefit curve. What this would mean is that the curve will illustrate the level of benefit that society receives from the consumption of every extra unit on the good. Think of the meaning of the name, marginal social benefit. Marginal is usually used to refer to something extra, in this case the extra good we consume. And social benefit relates to the benefit that society receives. Following a similar analysis, we can call the true supply curve to be the marginal social cost curve. This time it would mean that this curve will illustrate the cost to society of producing that one extra unit of output. Let's have a look at a graphical illustration. This is the point where we were before. Supply equals to demand at equilibrium. Now imagine that instead of supply and demand, we have the marginal social cost and the marginal social benefit. Notice that with every consecutive unit, the marginal social benefit gets progressively smaller. It should make sense. When we consume the first unit of a product, we receive the greatest benefit from it. With every additional unit that we consume, we still receive benefit, but that benefit decreases. Similarly, the production of every next unit of a good will cost to us more than the previous unit, because initially we were using the most efficient resources to produce those goods, and as we increase output, we have to use less efficient resources. So we can simply ignore the supply and demand and illustrate this diagram as simply the intersection between the marginal social cost and the marginal social benefit. We are going to show the equilibrium as E optimal in order to stress that this is the optimal equilibrium on the market. And as usual, the price at equilibrium is PE and the quantity at equilibrium is QE. This essentially means that at equilibrium, the benefit that society receives from the production of the last unit is equal to the cost society paid to produce that last unit. If we want to recapture that, we can summarize this following. In equilibrium, the marginal social cost should equal to the marginal social benefit. This would mean that the last unit produced should cost to society the same amount as the benefit from the last consumed unit of the good. Now, in order to understand externalities, we need to distinguish between the private and the social. Think of our example with Mr. Green, Mr. Yellow, and Mr. Red. Mr. Green was the seller, Mr. Yellow was the buyer, and Mr. Red was another third party, just an individual. Together the three of them form society, but each one of them can be regarded individually as a private consumer, producer, or just a bystander. So formally, the social cost and benefit represent the cost and benefit to the whole of society. That includes the buyers, such as Mr. Yellow, the sellers, such as Mr. Green, the other people, such as Mr. Red, but also features something like the environment. It is part of our society and we should understand it as such. However, every individual has his or her private notion of a cost and benefit. For me, something might be more expensive than it is for society. Similarly, I might receive a different benefit than society receives as a whole. As a result, we would often act according to our own private costs and benefits, and we would disregard the social costs and benefits. We basically want to achieve the maximum benefit at the lowest cost for ourselves, and by doing so we might disregard the social costs and benefits. Whenever this happens, it would create an inequality between the social and the private curves. Then the difference can be regarded as an externality or as an external cost or benefit. Let's have a look at the graphical example. We are back to our original diagram with the marginal social cost and the marginal social benefit, and we said that E optimal represents the optimal equilibrium for society. Imagine that people disregard the social cost and the social benefit, act on their own, and we can generate a marginal private cost and a marginal private benefit. When we have a different marginal private cost and a marginal private benefit, then we can expect that the equilibrium would happen at the intersection of the marginal private cost MPC and the marginal private benefit MPB, simply because individuals would look at their own costs and benefits and not the social ones. In this case, we see that the market will be located at E private instead of the E optimal, so we are not located at the true equilibrium point. We can see in this diagram also that the marginal social cost is greater than the marginal private cost, that the marginal social benefit is less than the marginal private benefit. We see that the marginal private cost is equal to the marginal private benefit, and this E optimal equilibrium where the marginal social cost is equal to the marginal social benefit, it simply does not exist. We are on E private, we are not on E optimal. We can summarize our four types of externalities as the following. First, the positive externality of production. This would create a situation where a product is being underconsumed. In this situation, the marginal private cost would be greater than the marginal social cost. As a result, people would want to underproduce this product because to them this product is seen as very expensive to produce. The second positive externality is the one of consumption. When we have a positive externality of consumption, we actually have underconsumption of a product. In this situation, the marginal private benefit is smaller than the marginal social benefit. This is why the product is being underconsumed. The individual sees too little benefit of consuming the product, while it's obviously useful to society to consume this product more. The first negative externality is the one of production. When we have a negative externality of production, we actually generate overproduction of a product. In this case, the marginal private cost is smaller than the marginal social cost. This is why the private entrepreneur sees it as profitable to continue producing because his or her cost is too little. The second negative externality is of consumption. When we have negative externality of consumption, we are over-consuming a good. This is because the marginal private benefit is greater than the marginal social benefit. And as a result, the benefit for the individual, the consumer, is much greater than the benefit for the society. Now, don't worry if you don't remember these relationships right now. We are going to look at each one individually, and you will see through the interaction of a marginal private cost, marginal social cost, marginal private benefit, and marginal social benefit, how these externalities actually work. Okay, let's have a look at positive externalities of production first. Now, like we said, these externalities occur whenever the private cost exceeds the social costs. As a result, firms do not like to produce as many users as it is socially desirable. For example, sometimes firms do not like to sponsor their employees to obtain better qualifications because these firms are afraid that once their workers are better qualified, they would actually quit their jobs and move to another competitive firm which is willing to pay them a higher salary. As a result, these firms would not be training their workers, and while society overall would benefit from more experienced workers, we actually do not observe that to happen because firms are too afraid that they might lose their trained workforce. Okay, let's have a look at a graphical illustration of this situation. This diagram illustrates a positive externality of production. Notice that at the moment the marginal private cost is not equal to the marginal social cost. As a matter of fact, for every unit of output, the marginal private cost is greater than the marginal social cost. At the same time, we only have one marginal social benefit, which illustrates the fact that the marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal private benefit. At our equilibrium E private, the marginal private cost would equal to the marginal social benefit. Also at this equilibrium, the price would be PPR and the quantity would be QPR. The optimal equilibrium, on the other hand, is E optimal, where we are going to observe a lower price PE and a higher quantity QE. So immediately we can notice that at the private equilibrium, the price is set too high and the quantity is set too little, meaning that society underproduces this product. Next, notice the vertical distance between the private equilibrium and the marginal social cost. This double-edged arrow noted X. This arrow represents the level of this positive externality of production. Finally, note also the potential gain to welfare. The next type of externality is called negative externality of production. Like we said, these occur whenever the private costs of the producer are smaller than the social costs that are borne by the whole society. As a result, firms would like to produce more than is socially desirable. An example of a negative externality of production could be a polluting factory. When the factory pollutes the air, the polluted air affects the neighboring houses and damages the environment. However, from the perspective of the private entrepreneur, this is a cost to society, not to the factory. The entrepreneur would simply consider the costs of production, such as raw materials, labor, utilities, but not the cost that is being done to the environment. Let's have a look at a graphical illustration of this negative externality of production. Okay, in this example we can see that the marginal social cost is not equal to the marginal private cost. However, this time the marginal social cost is greater than the marginal private cost for all levels of output. As a result, we again have a private equilibrium which is not equal to the optimal equilibrium. The private equilibrium is noted by E private and is at the point where the marginal private cost intersects the marginal social cost. The corresponding price is PPR and the corresponding quantity is QPR. The optimal equilibrium is at the point where the marginal social cost intersects the marginal social benefit and the corresponding price is PE and the corresponding quantity is QE. Again, we see that PE and PPR are not equal and QE and QPR are not equal. When we have a negative externality of production, the optimal price PE is greater than the private price PPR. Similarly, the optimal quantity QE is less than the private quantity produced QPR. As a result, once again, we are going to generate an externality. Now, to illustrate this externality, we will draw a double-edged arrow starting from the private equilibrium vertically up to the marginal social cost. This distance between the marginal private cost and the marginal social cost at the quantity produced QPR represents the negative externality of production. Again, we also have a shaded triangle. The yellow triangle is called deadweight loss to society or simply loss of welfare. This is the harm done to society by overproducing this good. So if you want to relate this to our example of the polluting factory, the factory owner would consider his cost to be the marginal private cost, while the cost to society, which will include the polluted environment, would be represented by the MSC, the marginal social cost. By overproducing this unit, we are actually wasting resources and generating a deadweight loss to society, which is represented by the yellow triangle. The third type of externality was the positive externality of consumption. When it occurs, we have a situation when the social benefits would exceed the private ones. As a result, to society it would be better that different individuals would consume this product, but from the perspective of an individual, they do not necessarily see the benefit of consuming the product. So we can summarize that individuals do not like to consume as many units as is socially desirable. And examples of positive externality of consumption are the young people who do not like to pay their healthcare insurance or to contribute to the retirement funds. Another example is education. When people are young, they feel healthy, they feel optimistic, they think that they'll stay healthy and will be earning high salaries for the rest of their lives, so they do not necessarily see the importance of actually spending money on healthcare insurance or to contribute to retirement funds. Now, when they get older, then these people would usually start having health-related problems, and then if they haven't been paying their healthcare insurance during their early life, they wouldn't be able to be contributing members of society. With education, it's exactly the same problem. When children are young, they don't necessarily enjoy education. They think they're forced to do it and they don't want to finish school or go to university. However, as they grow older, it is necessary to have a good education in order to be able to find a good job in life and to prosper. Let's have a look at a graphical illustration of this positive externality of consumption. In this diagram, we have a marginal social cost, which is one curve to illustrate that the marginal social cost this time is equal to the marginal private cost, but we have two benefit curves. These are the marginal social benefit and the marginal private benefit. Again, the marginal social benefit and the marginal social cost would equal at the optimal equilibrium when we would have the price in equilibrium and the quantity in equilibrium. E optimal is the socially desirable point. However, at the moment, society would be located at the private equilibrium, E-private. This is the point where the marginal private benefit intersects with the marginal social cost. We can see that the resulting price is equal to PPR, which is less than PE, and the resulting quantity is QPR, which is less than QE. So in this situation, people are paying less than they should be and are consuming less of this product than they should be. We can see the value of the externality by showing a double-edged arrow from the private equilibrium vertically up to the marginal social benefit. This distance between marginal private benefit and marginal social benefit represents the difference in benefit to society at the level of output QPR. We can also draw a potential gain to welfare. It would be a yellow shaded triangle as illustrated on the diagram. The last type of an externality is called the negative externality of consumption. As we have seen, these occur whenever the social benefits are smaller than the private ones. Therefore, the individual would see greater benefit from consuming this product than society would see overall. As a result, individuals would also consume more units than it is socially desirable. For example, smoking in public places. A smoker will receive a benefit from smoking because he needs to consume a certain amount of nicotine. However, the smoke that the smoker would consume would be potentially harmful to other non-smokers who might be around this smoker. Therefore, we would see a situation when the individual is consuming more of a product, in this case the cigarettes, than it is socially desirable. Let's have a look at the graphical illustration. In this case, once again, we have a different marginal private benefit and marginal social benefit. Like in the previous example, the marginal social cost is just a single line to represent that there is no difference between the marginal social cost and the marginal private cost. However, the marginal private benefit is greater than the marginal social benefit at all levels of output. As a result, we can see that once again we have a private equilibrium which is different than the optimal equilibrium. E-private marks the higher price PPR and higher quantity QPR than the optimal price and quantity PE and QE. As a result, people are spending too much money on this product and are consuming more units than they should be. We can see the level of externality as the vertical distance between the private equilibrium and the marginal social benefit. This double-edged arrow represents the externality. We can also show the deadweight loss to society as this yellow shaded rectangle that starts from the private equilibrium, goes vertically down, and then the other angle is at the optimal equilibrium point. Luckily, there are solutions to each of the four types of externalities, so let's have a look at them. For positive externalities of production, we would want such solutions that would bring down the production costs to the private firms in order to encourage greater productivity so that firms would be able to meet the socially desirable level of output. In order to correct positive externalities of production, we would need to encourage governmentally sponsored training, support firms by offering subsidies for training, ensure that people can take time off work to undergo additional training, promote lifelong learning. Notice that each of these would stimulate the private firm to pay for that training of its workers. If the government is paying for the training, then firms would be willing to send workers to acquire better qualifications. We can give directly subsidies to firms for training, though many argue that firms might be using these subsidies for other purposes, which is why the first method, through governmentally sponsored training, is preferred. We can promote lifelong learning, and we can make such laws that would guarantee people the right to undergo additional training. For example, governments might say that every worker has a right to take time off from work and to enroll in whatever course he or she desires to. Let's look at a graphical illustration of how these solutions would work. So in this diagram we have a positive externality of production. We again see that the marginal private cost is greater than the marginal social cost. The double-edged black arrow, which shows the vertical distance between the private equilibrium and the marginal social cost, represents the positive externality of production, and the yellow triangle is the potential gain to welfare. Notice that if the government gives subsidies to the firms or decides to undergo training of the workers by paying for the actual training, the cost to the firms would decrease. We can illustrate this the following way. Note that by shifting the marginal private cost to become equal to the marginal social cost, we have managed to move the private equilibrium to the optimal. Now the price of the optimal equilibrium equals to the price of the private equilibrium, and the same is true for the quantity. Let's have a look one more time to see what we just did. Our private cost was above the marginal social cost. We gave subsidies to the firms, or we cut down their costs by allowing them to send their workers to be trained at governmentally owned institutions, and as a result the marginal private cost decreased and the curve was shifted to the right until it was equal to the marginal social cost. Next, let's have a look at solutions for negative externalities of production. One way to correct these is by using taxes which would increase the cost of the producer to make it equal to the social cost. Another solution would be to provide property rights. If we provide property rights to the party which is harmed, then this party would be able to seek compensations from the polluting party. Alternatively, we can also provide property rights to the polluting party. Then it will be in the interest of the polluting party to actually preserve the environment. A third solution would be to establish a missing market, such as a market for tradable permits. If in order to pollute a person needs to buy a tradable permit, then this tradable permit would establish the price of pollution. Now what is important is that in these missing markets everybody can participate. So the harmed society would also be able to bid for the tradable permits if it does not want the factory to pollute its ground. Let's have a look at a graphical illustration of the first solution to the negative externalities of production, or more precisely by having a tax. This diagram illustrates a negative externality of production. We can see that the externality is equal to the vertical distance between the private equilibrium and the marginal social cost. The marginal private cost is less than the marginal social cost, which is why this good is being overproduced, and QPR represents the quantity produced by the private equilibrium, and QE is the optimal quantity. If we set a tax T, which would be equal to the externality X, we are going to increase the marginal private cost by the tax until they actually become equal to the marginal social cost. Let's have a look. Notice that by putting a tax T, we were able to shift the marginal private cost to become marginal private cost plus the tax, and now it is equal to the marginal social cost. We have essentially moved the private equilibrium to the point where the private equilibrium coincides with the optimal equilibrium. Let's have a look one more time. The yellow triangle is the deadweight loss to society. By putting a tax which is equal to the level of externality, we are going to increase the marginal private cost until it becomes equal to the marginal social cost. So you see the red line now illustrates the old marginal private cost, but it's no longer adequate because from the perspective of the individual firm, its private cost will be equal to MPC plus T, which is identical to the marginal social cost. Now there is one serious drawback to this solution, and it comes from the fact that in order to set the tax equal to the level of the externality, we need to know the precise amount of the externality. Theoretically, we can say that the externality is the difference between the marginal social cost and the marginal private cost, but in reality, you have to realize that it's very difficult to calculate this precise difference. Think again of the polluting factory. Imagine how difficult would it be to estimate the exact damages done by the pollution from the factory. For example, which pollution is caused by the factory and which pollution was caused by other factors. Just to think of that, it should be fairly obvious that it will be very hard to estimate the true value of X, and since we cannot estimate the true value of X, we wouldn't be able to set a correct tax. If we set an incorrect tax, we might have a situation like this. Notice that this time the tax that was placed was smaller than the original externality. So the solution was to increase the marginal private cost. Again, the marginal private cost is equal to MPC plus T, but it still does not match the marginal social cost. The externality has decreased, the deadweight loss to society has decreased, but still we have a market failure. We have not managed to correct the market effectively. This is one of the drawbacks of a direct intervention. The taxation method is a method of direct intervention, and we can see that when we intervene correctly, as we did in the first case, look at our intervention over here. We were able to set the tax equal to the externality, and as a result our solution was perfect. However, in this next example, the tax that we initially placed was simply too little, and we might be thinking that at the new equilibrium, where the marginal private cost plus the tax is equal to the marginal social benefit, we have managed to internalize the externality, but the fact remains that the true and optimal equilibrium E would not be achieved. Let's have a look at some of the solutions for positive externalities of consumption. Now, we said that these externalities would involve cases when the consumers are under-consuming a product because they don't see the potential benefit that they would be receiving, while the benefit to society is much greater. So some of the potential solutions would be to require mandatory participation. We simply do not give the option to anybody to not consume the product. This is what many countries do. They actually require you to pay social contributions, whether or not you like it. A second solution would be to provide government subsidies in order to stimulate that greater consumption. We can once again give property rights, and this is what many governments also have done. They have given the right to everybody to free education, and in this case people would want to be educated because it is their right to do so. We can also use positive advertising in order to stimulate consumption of these products. For example, we can encourage people to spend money on social health care and retirement funds. Let's have a look at the graphical illustration how these solutions might work. Okay, this is the starting point of positive externalities of consumption. We see that we are under-consuming because our private equilibrium is below the optimal equilibrium. We are paying too little, PPR is less than PE, and we're consuming too little, QPR is less than QE. By creating any form of stimulant that would encourage the private individual to consume more, we are actually going to shift the marginal private benefit until it becomes equal to the marginal social benefit. As you can see, when we shift the marginal private benefit to the right, we are effectively moving the private equilibrium to become equal to the optimal equilibrium. So in this case, now the marginal social cost is equal to the marginal private cost, and we have managed to achieve the correct price and correct quantity. A word of advice: using positive advertising or any of the other methods work again in theory, but in practice sometimes it is very difficult to actually encourage private individuals to increase their consumption and to effectively spend more of their money on goods because it is for the better of society. Just keep that in mind. Okay, last we're going to look at the negative externality of consumption. Negative externalities of consumption once again occur whenever the benefit to the individual exceeds the social benefit. So the result is that individuals like to overconsume these products. Solutions for negative externalities of consumption would be to introduce restrictions for fewer consumption. We can actually tell smokers you cannot smoke in public places, you cannot smoke in public institutions, in restaurants, places like that. That would restrict their ability to smoke. We can use negative advertising. A lot of countries now have legislation which requires cigarette makers to place warning labels on the cigarette packs that say, for example, smoking can kill, it can make you sick, it can generate lung cancer, do not smoke, it is bad for your health, etc. We can also provide property rights. Now, the solution where I was telling you about introducing restrictions for fuel consumption was also an example of a provision of property rights. By saying that smokers cannot smoke in restaurants, we actually are providing property rights to non-smokers. Non-smokers now have the right to go to a restaurant and breathe non-smoke while they're having a meal. A final solution would be to include a tax. Now, similarly to the case when we had a negative externality of production, a tax can be used in order to decrease the level of consumption, and we will see how it works. Okay, let's have a look at a graphical illustration with negative externalities of consumption and how these solutions will provide a correction to the equilibrium. This diagram shows again negative externality of consumption. Again, note that the externality is equal to the vertical distance between the private equilibrium and the marginal social benefit. The yellow triangle is the dead weight loss to society. We are at the moment at E private and the optimal equilibrium is E optimal. So you can see hopefully that we are spending too much money, PPR instead of PE per unit, and we are also over consuming. We are consuming QPR, which is more than QE, that is the socially optimal quantity to be consumed. If we use negative advertising, the goal would be to actually decrease the marginal private benefit to these consumers. If we also use property rights, then we would limit the ability of the consumers to actually consume the product at places where they typically would buy it and use it. Let's again talk about the restaurants and smoking in restaurants. If we actually tell smokers that they cannot smoke in restaurants, we are going to effectively decrease their demand because legally they would not have the right to smoke. The result would be the following. The marginal private benefit would decrease and graphically would shift to the left until it becomes equal to the marginal social benefit. When that happens, the private equilibrium would move and would become equal to the optimal equilibrium, and again the private price would equal to the optimal price, the private quantity would be equal to the optimal quantity, so the market would be efficient. We wouldn't have neither overconsumption nor underconsumption. We would consume the right amount of this product. We also looked that these negative externalities of consumption can be solved by using a tax. As was the case with the negative externalities of production, in order to effectively correct the market with a tax, we would need the tax to be equal to the level of the externality. Notice, however, what happens when we use this tax. Remember, the tax would have an impact on the cost, not on the benefit. Taxes affect supply, not demand. So when we put a tax on this product, what we are going to do is shift the marginal social cost to a new level. Let's have a look. Notice that when we shifted the marginal social cost so that it became MSC plus T, the red line, we moved the private equilibrium to a new private equilibrium, which is equal to PPR2. PPR2 is also equal to PE plus T, and where T is the tax, but T is also equal to the negative externality. So when we were using this tax, we were able to correct the externality because once again consumers would be only using the right amount of units in this market. There is no problem anymore of overconsumption. The consumption is equal to QPR2, which is also equal to QE. However, the government would be able to generate quite a bit amount of revenue. And if you're a higher level unit, you should be able to spot that the tax revenue to the government would be equal to the area of the rectangle PPR2, E private 2, E optimal, and PE. What to do with this money would be a choice that the government has to make, but usually the money collected from taxes on smoking would be best spent if they're invested in healthcare, so that the government can build more hospitals, can provide better healthcare services, and can maintain the population in good shape. This concludes our lesson on externality. Remember, however, that externalities are just one of the topics included in the unit on market failure. And if you want to have a good overall understanding of market failure, you should also study the sections on lack of public goods, on common access resources, on threat to environmental sustainability, and if you're a higher level student, you should also be aware that market failure can occur from asymmetric information and from abuse of monopoly power. Having said that, I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I hope that it made clearer how externalities work, what they are, and what solutions there are to the four types of externalities. And once again, thank you for watching, and see you next time.